The judge hadn't even left the courtroom when I heard someone laugh behind me. "She'll be back asking for help within a month." I didn't turn around. I picked up the same handbag I'd carried since the first day of the trial and walked toward the courthouse exit. Outside, people suddenly stopped talking. Not because of me. Because something unexpected had just landed beyond the courthouse gates. And for the first time that day, the people who had spent months judging my life looked completely uncertain. My name is Amelie Dlamini, and 12 years ago I married the man I believed would grow old beside me. While my husband, Kagiso, became the public face of our family's success, I quietly built systems, negotiated contracts, solved crises, and protected our investments behind the scenes. None of it appeared on social media. None of it came with applause. Over time, people began believing I contributed nothing because they never saw what I actually did. When our marriage ended, that invisible work became invisible worth. His relatives called me lucky. His friends called me replaceable. Even during the divorce proceedings, they described me as someone who had lived comfortably on another person's achievements. I listened without interrupting, because I had stopped trying to convince people who had already chosen their version of the truth. The last morning inside the courtroom felt much quieter than I had imagined. After months of meetings, paperwork, and painful conversations, everything was finally coming to an end. The judge looked over the last documents, asked a few final questions, and then made the divorce official. It had taken less than an hour to end the 12 years that Kagiso and I had spent together. The house, the savings, the investments, and everything else had already been divided according to the agreement. One by one, we signed every document placed in front of us. When the last paper was signed, the judge stood up and left the courtroom. Just like that, my marriage was over. People slowly began packing their bags and talking quietly with each other. Kagiso stood with his relatives while I carefully placed my copies of the documents into my handbag. As I turned to leave, I heard his older sister speak loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "She never built anything on her own," she said with a smile. A few relatives laughed softly. Some nodded as if they completely agreed with her. Not a single person spoke up for me. Not one person asked if her words were true. They had already decided who I was long before we entered that courtroom. I looked at my lawyer, thanked her for standing beside me through the difficult months, and shook her hand with a grateful smile. Then I picked up my handbag and calmly walked toward the exit. I did not stop to defend myself. I did not argue. I did not even look back at the people who believed they knew my whole life. They watched me leave and probably thought I was broken, ashamed, or defeated. But they were completely wrong. My silence did not mean they had won. It simply meant I was tired of explaining my worth to people who had already chosen not to see it. From that moment on, I was ready to let my future speak louder than any argument ever could. Long before I met Kagiso, I had already started building a career that meant everything to me. I worked with a small aviation technology company that helped move important supplies and business goods across southern Africa. In those early years, the company was still growing. We had a small team, limited resources, and many challenges. I spent long days solving problems, studying better systems, and helping the company improve. I believed that good work did not need loud attention. If we kept doing the right thing, success would come with time. When Kagiso came into my life, I never stopped working. I simply chose to keep my career private. I never felt the need to tell everyone about my position or explain how much I was involved in the company. I believed my actions mattered more than my words. While many people enjoyed showing their success, I preferred staying behind the scenes. I was a silent shareholder, and I also helped make important business decisions. I joined planning meetings, reviewed contracts, suggested new ideas, and helped solve difficult problems whenever they appeared. Many of those meetings happened during business trips with Kagiso. People often saw us walking into the same hotels or office buildings together. They smiled politely and assumed I was only there because I was his wife. Some even greeted me without asking what I actually did. They believed I was simply keeping him company while he handled important business. I never corrected them because I was focused on my work, not on changing people's opinions. Over the years, those wrong ideas became accepted as the truth. Friends, relatives, and even some business partners believed Kagiso was the only successful person in our marriage. They saw him giving speeches, attending public events, and appearing in photographs. They never saw me studying reports late at night, joining online meetings, negotiating difficult agreements, or helping make decisions that protected the company during hard times. The most important work often happened where no cameras were waiting. No one ever stopped to ask about my career. No one wondered why business leaders greeted me with respect or why my phone never stopped ringing during important projects. They only believed what they could easily see. Little by little, their assumptions became facts in their minds. By the time the divorce began, almost everyone believed I had simply lived comfortably because of Kajiso. They had no idea that I had spent years quietly building something valuable. Soon, the truth they had ignored for so long was finally going to come into the open. I walked through the courthouse doors with my handbag in one hand and my divorce papers in the other. The warm afternoon air touched my face as I took a slow breath. Behind me, I could still hear people talking. Some were discussing the court case, while others were whispering about my future. I knew many of them believed my life had just fallen apart. They thought I was leaving with nothing except a few papers and painful memories. None of them knew that my real story was only beginning. Just as I reached the front steps, a sleek private aircraft appeared in the sky. It slowly descended toward the executive airfield located just beyond the courthouse grounds. The airfield was often used by business travelers and company leaders, so seeing an aircraft there was not unusual. But the timing caught everyone's attention. People stopped walking and turned their heads toward the runway. Even the reporters standing outside the courthouse became curious. Several journalists grabbed their cameras and hurried toward the gates, hoping an important public figure had just arrived. Around me, Kajiso's relatives looked at one another with confused faces. His older sister smiled confidently and said that some famous businessman must be arriving for another court case. Another relative nodded and agreed. They were all trying to guess who could be inside the aircraft. Not one of them imagined it had anything to do with me. In their minds, I was still the woman they had called worthless only a few minutes earlier. While everyone else kept staring toward the runway, my phone gently vibrated in my hand. I looked down at the screen and saw a short message. It simply said, "We're ready whenever you are." I read it once, locked my phone, and quietly smiled to myself. It was not the kind of smile that came from showing off or proving someone wrong. It came from knowing that everything I had worked for over many years was waiting for me outside that courthouse. The aircraft was never meant to impress strangers. It was simply part of the business I had helped build long before I married Kajiso. Every long meeting, every difficult decision, every problem I had quietly solved had led to this moment. While everyone believed my future had ended inside that courtroom, my future was actually waiting just beyond the courthouse gates. They were watching an aircraft land, but I was looking at something much bigger. I was looking at the life I had built with my own hard work, a life that no divorce could ever take away. As everyone continued watching the aircraft, I stood quietly near the courthouse steps. I was not in a hurry. I simply waited, knowing someone would arrive in a few moments. Kajiso's relatives were still talking among themselves. Some were trying to guess who had landed, while others continued looking at me with the same judgment they had carried throughout the divorce. They believed they already knew everything about my life. They had never imagined that they might be completely wrong. A few minutes later, a woman wearing a neat navy suit walked confidently toward the courthouse entrance. She carried a leather folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. She looked professional and calm, as if she had done this many times before. Several people stepped aside to let her pass. Many assumed she was looking for an important executive or a well-known lawyer. No one paid much attention until she walked straight toward me. She smiled warmly and said, "Good afternoon, Ms. Dlamini. I hope everything went smoothly." Then she gently shook my hand before opening her folder. "Your afternoon meeting has been confirmed. The board members are already waiting and the transport team is ready whenever you are. We have also prepared the documents you requested for today's investment discussion." Her voice was respectful but natural, like this was part of our normal routine. I nodded, thanked her, and quickly looked through the papers she handed me. We quietly discussed a few changes to the schedule. She reminded me about a video conference later that evening with international partners and asked if I wanted to review one final contract before the meeting. I answered a few questions, signed one page, and handed the folder back to her. That was the moment everything changed. Behind me, the conversations suddenly became quiet. I noticed people staring without saying a word. Kagiso's older sister looked confused. His relatives stopped whispering. Even some of the reporters who had been focused on the aircraft turned their attention toward us. They realized the woman had not come looking for Kagiso. She had come for me. Questions quickly spread through the crowd. Who is this woman? Why was she speaking to Amelie like an important business leader? What meeting was waiting for her? Why was someone they had just called worthless discussing investments and board members? For the first time that day, nobody looked confident anymore. The story they had believed for years no longer made sense. They suddenly realized they had spent all this time judging a woman whose real life they had never even tried to understand. In that quiet moment, I saw something I had never seen on their faces before. It was not respect yet. It was uncertainty. And sometimes, that is where the truth begins. A few days after the divorce, life became much quieter. I returned to my work and focused on the projects waiting for me. I did not give interviews. I did not post anything on social media. I never tried to tell my side of the story because I believed the truth did not need a public argument. I simply continued doing what I had been doing for many years. While other people were still talking about the divorce, I was attending meetings, reviewing business plans, and helping my team prepare for the next stage of growth. Later that week, something unexpected happened. A respected investigative journalist published a long feature about business leaders who were quietly changing the future of logistics and aviation across Africa. The article focused on people who worked behind the scenes instead of standing in front of cameras. It explained how many successful companies depended on leaders who rarely appeared in public but made important decisions every day. As people continued reading, they reached one profile that surprised almost everyone. It was mine. The article shared the story of my journey from joining a small aviation technology company to becoming one of its most trusted strategic leaders. It explained how I had helped improve transportation systems, guided difficult business decisions, supported young professionals, and worked with teams across several countries. It also described how I had remained a silent shareholder for years, choosing to invest my energy into building the company instead of building a public image. The journalist never mentioned my divorce. There was not a single sentence about Kagiso or our marriage. The story was only about my work, my experience, and the people whose careers had grown because of my guidance. That was what made the article so powerful. My success did not depend on proving anyone wrong. It stood on its own. Soon my phone started ringing. Old classmates sent messages saying they had no idea I had achieved so much. Former colleagues congratulated me and said they were proud to finally see my story being told. Young professionals thanked me for inspiring them to keep working quietly even when nobody noticed their efforts. The biggest surprise came from people who had judged me only a few days earlier. Kagiso's relatives read the same article as everyone else. They looked at the photographs, the interviews, and the long list of projects connected to my name. For the first time, they understood that the woman they had called worthless had never depended on Kagiso's success. She had been creating her own success long before they ever met her. Their opinions changed almost overnight. Not because I argued with them. Not because I defended myself. The truth had finally reached them without me saying a single word. Sometimes the strongest answer is not given in a courtroom. Sometimes it is written by years of quiet work that finally receives the recognition it deserves. The article changed many people's opinions about me, and I would be lying if I said it did not feel good. It was satisfying to know that my years of hard work were finally being seen. People who had ignored my achievements were now speaking kindly about me. Some even apologized for the things they had said in the past. But even with all that recognition, I quickly realized something important. Success could change how people looked at me, but it could not instantly remove the pain I had carried for years. There were still memories that stayed with me. I remembered the family dinners where everyone listened carefully whenever Kagiso shared an idea, but the room became quiet whenever I spoke. I remembered giving helpful suggestions that were completely ignored until someone else repeated the same idea. I remembered smiling politely while people praised my husband for achievements that I had quietly helped make possible. Those moments had left deep marks on my heart. I also remembered the introductions at family events and business gatherings. People would shake my hand and smile before saying, "So you're Kagiso's wife." Very few people ever asked what I did for a living or what I had accomplished. It was as if my own identity disappeared the day I got married. After hearing those words again and again for many years, I slowly started believing that maybe my work really did not matter as much as everyone else's. Healing from those experiences was not as simple as reading kind comments or seeing my name in a newspaper. Every painful memory needed time. Every disappointment had to be accepted before I could truly move forward. I learned that emotional wounds do not disappear the moment life becomes successful. They heal little by little as you choose peace instead of anger. As I spent more time thinking about everything that had happened, I discovered that my greatest victory was not proving my ex-husband's family wrong. It was something much deeper than that. I finally understood that my value had never depended on their opinions. Whether they respected me or ignored me, whether they praised me or laughed at me, I was still the same person. My worth had always been there. That realization gave me a kind of peace that no award, business success, or newspaper article could ever provide. Headlines would eventually be forgotten. People's opinions would continue changing. But the confidence that came from truly knowing my own value would stay with me for the rest of my life. That lesson became the greatest success I had ever achieved. Several months passed after the divorce, and life became calmer. I was fully focused on my work, my team, and the new goals we were building together. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a charity leadership forum where business owners and community leaders gathered to discuss education, technology, and opportunities for young people. I accepted the invitation because I believe success should also be used to help others grow. After my presentation, people came to greet me and ask questions about my work. While I was speaking with a few guests, I noticed someone familiar standing across the room. It was Kajiso. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Neither of us looked away, but neither of us seemed uncomfortable. We had both moved forward with our lives. A little later, as the crowd became smaller, Kajiso slowly walked toward me. He greeted me politely and asked if we could speak for a few minutes. I agreed. We stepped into a quiet corner of the hall where people could still see us, but no one could hear our conversation. There was no anger between us. There were no raised voices or painful arguments. We were simply two people talking honestly after a long journey. For a few seconds, Kajiso looked at the floor before speaking. Then he took a deep breath and said something I had never expected to hear. I was wrong. I stayed silent and allowed him to continue. He admitted that during our marriage, he had often allowed other people to believe that every success belonged only to him. He said he knew how much work I had done behind the scenes. He had seen me solving problems, preparing strategies, and making difficult decisions that protected both our investments and the company. But instead of correcting people when they ignored my efforts, he remained quiet. He lowered his head and spoke with honesty. I told myself it wasn't important. But the truth is, I liked being seen as the person who carried everything. I allowed people to believe that because it made my own success appear bigger. His words surprised me more than any apology could have. He was not blaming his family. He was not making excuses. He was finally accepting responsibility for his own choices. I listened without interrupting. The pain of the past did not suddenly disappear, and hearing those words could never give back the years when I felt invisible. But his honesty brought something different. It brought peace. Sometimes a sincere truth cannot erase old wounds, but it can stop them from growing deeper. When our conversation ended, we wished each other well and walked in different directions. We were no longer husband and wife, but for the first time in many years, we had spoken with complete honesty. I realized that forgiveness does not always begin with an apology. Sometimes it begins when someone finally chooses the truth instead of protecting their pride. After my conversation with Kajiso, I thought about everything that had happened over the past few years. Many people expected me to enjoy the attention that came after the divorce. Some believed I would use every opportunity to remind others that they had been wrong about me. A few reporters even asked if I wanted to share my side of the story or speak about how my ex-husband's family had treated me. But I politely refused. I had no interest in turning someone else's embarrassment into my victory. Instead, I decided to spend my time building something that could truly change lives. Our company had already supported young professionals through internships and training programs, but I wanted to do more. I worked with my team to expand a mentorship program for young women who wanted careers in engineering, aviation, and technology. Many of them were talented, hardworking, and full of ideas, but they often struggled because people underestimated them before they even had a chance to prove themselves. Every month, I met with small groups of students and young professionals. We talked about their goals, their fears, and the challenges they faced. Some of them told me they were the only women in their classrooms. Others said people laughed when they shared their dreams of becoming engineers or aviation specialists. As I listened to their stories, I saw parts of my own journey in each of them. I always shared one simple lesson with them. You do not have to announce your value every single day, I would say. You do not need to argue with everyone who doubts you, but never allow another person's opinion to become your identity. People may misunderstand you today, but that does not decide who you will become tomorrow. Those words were not just advice. They came from my own experience. I knew how painful it felt to be ignored, judged, and underestimated. I also knew how dangerous it could be to believe those unfair opinions. That was why I wanted these young women to build confidence from within instead of waiting for approval from others. As the months passed, I watched many of them grow. Some earned scholarships. Some started successful careers. Others returned to tell me that they had finally believed in themselves because someone believed in them first. Their success brought me a happiness that no newspaper article or public praise could ever match. Looking at those young women reminded me why I had worked so hard all those years. It had never been about proving people wrong. It had always been about creating opportunities, solving problems, and helping others reach places they once believed were impossible. Applause fades with time, but purpose continues to change lives long after the crowd becomes quiet. A full year passed after the divorce, and life looked completely different. Every morning, I woke up with peace instead of worry. My days were filled with meaningful work, meetings with my team, and time spent helping young women build their careers. I no longer measured my life by what had happened in that courtroom. The divorce, which had once felt like the biggest moment of my life, slowly became only one small part of a much larger journey. People also stopped talking about the divorce. At first, many conversations had been about who had won, who had lost, and what would happen next. But as time went on, those questions disappeared. Instead, people spoke about the projects I was leading, the young professionals I was mentoring, and the businesses that continued to grow under my guidance. They no longer saw me as a divorced woman. They saw me as someone who had continued moving forward with strength and dignity. Whenever my name was mentioned, people remembered something different. They remembered the woman who stayed calm when others laughed at her. They remembered the woman who refused to answer insults with anger. They remembered that I never tried to embarrass anyone in return, even when I had every chance to do so. Many people told me that my quiet strength had inspired them more than any public argument ever could. One afternoon, I happened to drive past the same courthouse where my marriage had officially ended. I looked at the building through my car window for a few seconds before the traffic light turned green. It looked exactly the same as it had a year earlier. The walls had not changed. The doors were still there. People continued walking in and out with their own stories. But my feelings were completely different. That courthouse no longer represented pain or failure. It had become just another building in the city. The painful words that had once followed me everywhere had finally lost their power. I realized that memories only stay heavy when we keep carrying them. Once we choose to move forward, they slowly become lighter. Time had done something I never thought was possible. It had turned my hardest day into a lesson instead of a wound. Looking back, I understood that the moments that once felt impossible to survive had become the very moments that made me stronger. The pain had not disappeared overnight, but little by little, it became smaller. And as it became smaller, my future became much bigger than my past. One quiet evening, after finishing another long day at work, I drove to the private airfield where our company operated many of its flights. I often came there when I wanted a few peaceful moments to think. I stood near the runway, watching the ground crew prepare another aircraft for takeoff. The pilots completed their final checks. The lights on the runway began to shine more brightly, and the sky slowly turned darker as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. I watched the aircraft move forward until it gathered speed and lifted smoothly into the air. As I stood there, my thoughts returned to the day I had walked out of the courthouse. I remembered how everyone had stopped talking when they saw the private aircraft landing nearby. At that time, Many people believed the aircraft was the biggest surprise of the day. They thought that was the moment everything changed. But standing beside the runway now, I realized they had misunderstood the real story. The aircraft had never been the surprise. It was simply a tool for the work I had been doing for many years. It represented years of planning, sacrifice, late nights, difficult decisions, and quiet effort. It did not create my value. It only reflected the work I had already done long before anyone noticed. The real surprise was seeing how quickly people judged another person's worth by what they could see with their own eyes. When they believed I had nothing, they treated me as if I had no value. The moment they discovered my success, many of those same people completely changed the way they spoke to me. That experience taught me something I would never forget. A person's value cannot be measured by a house, a company, a title, or even a private aircraft. Those things may change with time. They can be gained, and they can also be lost. But true worth is built through character, honesty, hard work, kindness, and the courage to keep moving forward when nobody believes in you. I smiled as the aircraft disappeared into the evening sky. I finally understood that my worth had never depended on applause, public recognition, or anyone else's opinion. It had existed long before I became successful. It had existed before I married Kajiso. It had existed before I walked into that courtroom to sign the divorce papers. The day I truly accepted that truth, something